It is difficult to find the words to describe a novel that has used so many, that has seemed to cover the entirety of the human and emotional scope of possible vocabulary to produce a novel that is so exhaustive. Restless Dolly Maunder is a novel from the 1880s to the 1950s, and it is as ambitious in its sweeping narrative as the time frame that it covers. This is a fictional account, a reimagining of the author's maternal grandmother's life as she wonders, what has made my grandmother become this way? Why are women of her generation so cold, so stern, so withdrawn? Why are they seemingly so incapable of settling down and of enjoying a moment and of just thinking, I'm here, I made it, I can relax? Why can these women not allow themselves to settle down as if they live in the fear that it can all be taken away? And Restless Dolly Maunder is an exploration of these questions because it is not the story of one woman, it is not the story of one Dolly Maunder, but as the author writes, of these women who were our foremothers. Their stories are our history. Those mostly silent, mostly unrecorded women are where we come from. If we'd been born when they were, our lives would have been theirs. At any time before the present, and continuing now in many parts of the world, if you were born clever and energetic, but female, you had to endure a life of injustice and frustration. Dolly's story is so heartbreaking, perhaps because it could have so easily been ours. There's so much of Dolly in each and every one of us. All of the people who never pursued their dreams because at the critical moment their parents told them not to. All the people who were pressured to settle by aging and by society. All the people stuck in a situation which we would like to make better but can't because we can't afford to take the risk. Grit, perseverance, these are all qualities that Dolly Maunder displays in a way that would resonate with everyone because her struggles are, in so many of their different complex elements, our struggles too. And Dolly Maunder tells the story that is realistic because not every woman is a loud, outgoing activist voice. Not every woman is as brave as Malala to stand up and be willing to die for her rights. Not everyone is Greta Thunberg fighting for the perceived injustice that she sees. But so many women are in that very same situation that Dolly is. And this is a story about the many quiet women who are on the sidelines, who are not in the limelight, who are not in the front leading the fight or leading the struggle, but women who are just trying to make a life for themselves, women who are trying to break out of the cycle of poverty and forge a life that is better, at least somewhat, for themselves and better, noticeably, for their children. Dolly was born in 1881 on a farm near Kurababua, raised by a strict father who lived with the knowledge that Dolly's mother, his wife, married down, lived with the knowledge that all he really had was his family. And the sheep in front of him, all he really had was the farm, because people scorned them for their poverty or for their religion because the country was very split and divided in its opinions. So all you really had was the tight-knit family and the money that you physically held. There was nothing else. It depended on the income that they brought in from their farm work. And Thomas was very well aware that they lived towing the line, that they could at any instant slip into the brink of poverty because they were not so fortunate, but they were still more fortunate than their neighbors because Karabubila is in the middle of nowhere. The nearest town is like 200 miles away. It's a rural community. Many people go to school bare feet, and they only go to school because of later educational reforms. The majority of people don't get an education. The majority of girls certainly don't. It's rural, and it's 19th century. So he cares more about his sheep than family life, and Dolly does not know affection from that family. Really, the only people who are affectionate to her is her kind older sister and her mother, but they can never really understand her, and she never really feels quite at home. There's never really quite one moment where she suddenly feels that she's happy or passionate, except when the government introduces initiatives. Towards the end of the century, the cusp of the 20th century, they introduce a reform that says all children must get an education before the age of 14, before and up to the age of 14. So for the first time, farmers can't just call their daughters home and say, you're needed here, you're not needed in school. By law, they are obligated to be there, and suddenly Dolly finds herself where she wants to be, where she can be, where she can shine through and truly be herself. She allows her talents to shine, and she can see that she actually has potential, that she has brains, and she brings home a gold star nearly every week, and she dreams of becoming a teacher. She dreams of becoming independent, of of breaking away from the farm with its hard labor, of being slapped every time the bread doesn't rise perfectly. But when she turns 14, at that moment of decision, the decision really, like so many things in her life, is not up to her. It's up to her parents, and I say nominative parents because really it's up to her father. And her father says, out of the question, there's no way that you will be out there working. No daughter of mine will be working because it says things about him as a father that he cannot provide for his family. And so he refuses Dolly her dream, and he tells her that she should stay at home and help her mother until she's married. And well, she's on a farm. What other opportunities does Dolly have when the nearest town is so far away? She cannot simply leave and make her own way out in the world destitute with no parents as a girl at the turn of the 20th century. So Dolly stays, and it drives her crazy to have to endure the constant mood swings of her father, his constant insatisfaction if she oversleeps or makes a mistake when handling the back-breaking hard work that is having a massive farm and taking care of sheep and taking care of a family of men who need to be fed and clothed and the washing done and the ironing done. It's a tale of domesticity because really, what can Dolly do? Realistically, not speaking about fiction, not speaking about I don't know, movies, realistically, Dolly's story is the story of the majority of women because she chooses to walk the beaten track because that is a safe track. At least here, she knows the life that can await her. She knows what life expects and she knows she can survive. Making your way out there alone, walking the barren landscapes of Australia, is not a path for survival. So she stays, and she vows herself that one day she will get ahead. So she bides her time. Suddenly she turns 18, and then she turns 20, and then 25, and then suddenly she's 28 and she's still not married. And she realizes that if she wants to uphold her promise, if she really wants to make a life for herself and to become better, smarter, and to have her children become better and smarter than the opportunities given to her by her family, she needs to make it out. And the only way to make it out of your family home would be to be married. And her only prospect to be married is the farm hire with which she went to school, the boy that she still remembers as that boy with no shoes that she herself looked down on. He's the only prospect, and her family love him because he's good with the sheep, and her parents would approve. So here is the only prospect in her life to make a life away from her family. And yes, that would have to be a farmer's wife, the life that she never once wished for. And he's not the boy that she loves because the few boys that she liked would always turn away because she was just Dolly. Dolly with no prospects. Dolly who's relatively poor. Dolly whose religion was different from their own and they were Catholics, and of course you were gonna go to sin if you marry a woman who isn't Catholic. And so Dolly marries. And what follows is a story of her drive, because she wants to build a better life for herself, as she promised herself that one day in the kitchen, after realizing that she cannot escape and leave and live the life that she wanted to be. She wanted to be a school teacher, her father said no, and that door closed, and Dolly moves on. This is a story above all else of Dolly moving on, of Dolly pushing and being brutal about it, because in the process she hurts her relationship with her children. Eventually even her husband becomes scared enough of her for her to fear him and for them to make their decisions together, because she is driven by profit. She is the true capitalist of the 19th century, no, of the 19th and 20th century, because everything that Dolly does is to maximize profits in an effort to make a life for herself and for her children, the way that she promised herself so many years ago. Dolly's is honestly a story of not sitting still and doing everything that she can, even if it means forcing her family to be always on the move, even if it means forcing her children into an education that they don't necessarily want, even if it means sending her daughter to a Catholic school, Catholic, which she isn't, which she still feels so much trauma from her childhood where she was rejected for not being Catholic. So all of this drives Dolly, and it pushes her forward, and she wedges her foot sharply into the door as she attempts to break into the middle class. This is a story of social mobility and of the drive and of the dedication and of the hard work that's required to actually get in there when you were born in a rural community, when you were born working class. And she faces real setbacks, because as you can imagine, it was a difficult century. The Great Depression was a real setback. The Second World War made her realize how much she has lost in the relationship with her sons and her declining health, but yet throughout it all, through to her 70s, she remains restless and she refuses to settle down. She's always pushing, and she's just not happy to be a simple farmer's wife, just as she was not happy to live out the rest of her life on her family's farm, being told that she's stupid and that she's incapable when she knew that she was capable of much more. The sad part is that she remains that way throughout her entire life, even when she seems to make accomplishments. She's restless. That's the best description. That's why it's in the book, because she really just does not settle. She is unable to rest, and she's so embittered by her experiences, by the injustices that she faces, that she's always just plowing ahead. And at some point we want to pause and we say, but Dolly, look at where you've gotten. You're okay, no spoilers, but you're an owner of a grand business at some point, and here you are, born as a young girl on a farm in the middle of nowhere. Why are you not allowing yourself to enjoy this even briefly? And she says no, because there are still obstacles ahead of me, obstacles that I need to push through. And yet throughout it all, she follows the conventional path. Throughout it all, she's the dutiful woman, overlooking all of the problems in her family because she must do everything that she can for the sake of her children and her husband. And yet here she is pushing ahead and getting through. She overcomes obstacles upon obstacles, and at some point it gets really repetitive, but that's because Dolly's always in the move, so it's at once a strength and a weakness of the novel. Grenville's prose is economic, sharp, logical, pragmatic. There is no space for flowery metaphors, even if occasionally we have the occasional florid language, because that's the way Dolly is. At times, the constant restlessness of the novel, because it is told through largely Dolly's eyes, it becomes unbearable. The tension, the anxiety, the pressure of having to always be pushing for more, of never quite being able to satisfy, it gets to us, and we find ourselves wanting to put the book down and to just breathe and say, Dolly, breathe as well, please, this is too much. But there's something so captivating and so compelling in a woman who's made out of iron and who's at the same time just like everyone else, who's not some superhero, who's not this woman who's doing some inhuman, superhuman actions that we just cannot ever imagine. We just see a woman who's doing hard work. And Dolly makes so many mistakes, as I mentioned. She's often bitter, she's often unsympathetic, but the strength of the novel is that we understand why she is that way. We don't need to understand her, and nor can we ever fully understand her, and praise the heavens for that, because it's women like Dolly who paved the way for women like us and for the changes in society that we see. And I've seen quite a few reviews saying that they were disappointed in the novel because it's not really feminist enough. Like, there's not really anything about Dolly being a go-getter, fighting for women's rights or anything of the kind, because when her father told her you can't be a school teacher, she said okay and moved on. And I'm disappointed to hear that in the 21st century, we still somehow view that to be the only kind of acceptable fight for equality. Because Dolly demonstrates real life. She demonstrates that real life is not really always about shouting from the rooftops, sometimes about taking a softer approach and pushing and persevering to get her way. It doesn't always mean taking the brash and loud path forward and refusing anything that has been said to you by society and always making your own way. For some, it means doing what Dolly does. For most, in fact, it means doing what Dolly does, which is biding her time and quietly manipulating her circumstances and her husband until she is his equal, until she is his business partner. It is women like her who more often fight for the control that allows her future generation, her own children, to break out of the cycle. Even if she herself never quite breaks out of the cycle, even if she's not the one to become a teacher, to become the first woman in her family who's working, it's still her name is not on the list. She makes breakthroughs that allow her children to do this. She is the first step forward towards having actual social mobility, because it's not really just a novel about about gender or about sex or about the struggles for equality in a generation that had it so much worse than the 21st century. It's also about class and about the drive needed to break through that poverty. This is a book of quiet power, of, as the author writes, the transition generation. For women like her, born at the end of the 19th century, things were starting to change. These women hacked out a space so that the women who came after them could have a different future. If Dolly didn't bide her time, her children would never have had those opportunities. If Dolly pursued her dreams, we don't know what would have happened, and we can't be upset at her for not pursuing the dreams when she has taken the safer way out that has ensured that she, at the end, accomplished her goal. She vowed to be successful in one thing, breaking the cycle. And is that not what we can all aspire for, to move and to achieve that goal that we have set? One of the most emotional moments of the novel for me is towards the end when it's been through the cycle of generations and Dolly's talking to her granddaughter. And she sees the way in which the world has changed. Dolly's was not a loud voice. It was a quiet one, but it was loud for the generations after her. And I also love what the author said at the end of the story because it's precisely what made me enjoy the novel throughout. I haven't told the story of Dolly Maunder because she was unique or extraordinary. She wasn't, and that's the very reason I think her story is worth telling. It would have been repeated hundreds, even thousands of times, women doing their best against every obstacle to give their daughters a better chance at happiness than they'd had, and to find a corner of an unfriendly world where a woman could make a life for herself. So in short, this is a quiet sort of story, and yet it speaks volumes. It's slow-paced, there's not much action, there's not much loud events that make us hooked to the page. It's a story for self-reflection. It's a story of thinking on families, thinking of society, thinking of how times have changed and all the ways times haven't changed. Dolly is a difficult character, but a superbly complex one. Oftentimes she's so pretentious and she mirrors her mother and father in ways she probably herself cannot see, but Dolly takes the world in her stride and she moves on. And for some people that will be amazing to accept, that you can just move on, that you don't have to always fight, that you can make a new life for yourself, and for some that will not be something they will enjoy. I personally fall on the side of enjoyment because I think that this is a very new story. In a world that's constantly looking to grab your attention with loud stories, it's nice to see a quiet narrative. And in terms of literary merit, it sometimes falls flat. It's linear, it's a simplistic narrative. There's really nothing else that's like shocking and innovative, and not all of the characters are unfortunately fully fleshed out. A lot of the secondary characters are left underdeveloped as we rush forward. But I suppose it fits in with the narrative because it's Dolly who's the start of the show. She's the one who's detached or too quick or too brief, and this is why I cannot confidently give this novel more than 3.5 or 4 stars. Frankly, in its rush to tell the marathon and the complex race that is Dolly's life, it sometimes trips up and leaves us winded and panting for water and a break on the sidelines. At the same time, it's accessible, and it's I suppose why it's on the shortlist this year, because it moves away from that tendency I talked about of having loud success stories, and it tells the story of someone that not many would find inspiring in her domestic feminism, or someone who people would say is mediocre. What, she didn't really achieve much. What, she's still a farmer's wife at the end of the story. And this couldn't be further from the truth that I think Grenville tells particularly well. And the intimate nature of the novel, the fact that for Grenville this is personal, this is her grandmother, is I think what makes this novel so personal for us as well. And I also think that it needs to be said that Dolly is more privileged than most, because she's a white woman in Australia, and even her husband, with all his problems, is nice. He's not abusive. He allows Dolly, he actually listens to what Dolly has to say, he just doesn't dismiss her, and we don't really get the voices of the First Nations in Australia, the voices whose land Dolly technically takes away, and we get the narrative of a white woman who's very, very privileged, even with all her injustices. And it does feel somewhat tokenistic to, at the end of the novel, to just say, oh yeah, I acknowledge that there's another side of the story. So I personally think that it's the author is somewhat right that she's telling the specific story of Dolly and not all the other complicated stories of the women who are not like Dolly. But I think it's important to acknowledge that the book is supposed to tell the story of injustices and injustices that are somewhat overcome. But there are many injustices left in the shadows. And it's normal, but it's a warning from me to you. I suppose even acknowledging the fact that there exists another story is already progress, even if it does sometimes feel superficial or surface level. I can't help but think of women who were like Dolly with those dreams and motivations but died in obscurity. And the strength of this book is that it's very thought provoking and it makes you reflect on a lot of these issues. And I think that even if it's not necessarily a book that you can classify as your favorites, it's good as a conversation starter. And it's highly difficult to pinpoint exactly what you like and what you don't like. So in this review, I tried to center, spoiler free, on largely spoiler free. The majority of this you can get from the blurb. It's on the things that I personally found interesting. So if this sounds like a novel that you would enjoy, I would urge you to go for it. Thank you so much for making it this far. I hope you're enjoying my series on the Women's Prize for Fiction Shortlist 2024, and see you next week.